The Hamas network of tunnels beneath the Gaza Strip is a daunting obstacle for any attacking force. But this modern-day underground city is the result of thousands of years of innovation by dozens of civilizations. Tunnel networks have aided nations and organizations in warfare, survival, and more to adapt to a changing world. It's no wonder going underground has become a metaphor, not for disappearance, but precisely the opposite: to continue, to persevere, and to preserve in the face of adversity. And as you'll see, the roots of the word undermining don't come from just anywhere either. 4,000 years ago, the Assyrians referred to the tunnels they built under enemy fortifications to collapse them as mines. In this video, we're going to take you back to the distant origins of human civilizations, religions, battles, and pioneering events of civil engineering, and then return to the modern-day underground fortresses seen in the Middle East. The fascinating history of tunneling is sure to teach you something new. Buckle up, we're going underground. Before getting into our ancestors' first organized attempts at creating underground spaces for all kinds of purposes, it's worth asking ourselves what brought them there in the first place. Imagine what it must have been like for some of our early ancestors to descend into caves and cave systems, perhaps getting lost in there or bringing torches down, and after a subterranean journey, making it back out into the light of day or under the starry night sky. To us, it might seem claustrophobic, even dangerous and isolating, but most of the evidence of our remotest origins, in fact, come from caves and cave systems. While it's impossible to tell, in the 300,000 or so years of our history as a species, when exactly humans opted for caves to shelter themselves, or to engage in music, dance, painting, and other ritual practices, one thing is for sure: we've been cave-dwelling creatures for a huge period of time. As the years pass, we keep finding older and older instances of prehistoric cave paintings all around the world. Cave paintings in Namibia, Australia, Romania, France, Russia, Indonesia, Spain, Borneo, and scores of other locations dated from 25,000 all the way to 64,000 years ago, showcase our ancestors' remarkable inclination for artistic representation of the world they lived in and interacted with. We can't say for sure whether this wide-ranging activity was in any sense coordinated, or whether it formed a part of a greater overarching culture, but we can still be astonished by the complexity and intricacy of these practices and how clear it is that very early in the evolution of our species, a significant emphasis was already being placed on artistic consciousness and sacred spaces. But while the descent into caves and creation of stunning frescoes and carvings may form one large step in the evolution of our species and helps us to see the route we've taken toward underground works and living, there remains a pretty big gap between residing in caves and engaging in artistic practice there, and actually creating underground spaces for a range of different purposes. Arguably one of the biggest evolutionary leaps, and still one of the most inexplicable to historians of our species, was the beginning of monumental or megalithic architecture and construction beginning in Paleolithic times. Just think about the conditions needed to begin undertaking immense works like Stonehenge, the Pyramids of Giza, or the Sphinx, for example. There needs to be a common language and therefore a culture, and there needs to be some kind of order, social, political, or religious, through which a huge number of humans can coordinate their activities. What's stunning to some historians is that some works of megalithic architecture appear to predate farming. In 1994, a German archaeologist working 6 miles from Urfa, an ancient city in southeastern Turkey, discovered what is now to many experts considered to be the oldest standing temple in existence, filled with animal carvings, engravings, and scores of other artifacts which shed light into these prehistoric megalith builders. The site is called Göbekli Tepe in Turkish, which means Potbelly Hill, and it stands right in the middle of the cradle of civilization, or the Fertile Crescent, a region that stretches from the Persian Gulf to modern-day Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Palestine, and Egypt, which had the mild climate and arable land required for humans to make the first successful attempts at farming. Göbekli Tepe sits on a hill that's 50 feet tall and covers 9 hectares. Its main infrastructure consists of 16 or so pillars, some of which weigh up to a ton. These would have been cut elsewhere and hoisted up the hillside, a massive undertaking to say the least. What's most impressive is that after mapping the terrain and examining the hillside, archaeologists realized that their 1-acre excavation comprised about 5% of the total site to be excavated. But it wasn't just that they barely scratched the surface. They realized that the entire hill was, in all likelihood, man-made. More evidence made matters even stranger. It became clear that these really were hunter-gatherers after looking over hundreds of thousands of bone fragments of the site, and there were no cooking hearths, identifiable houses, or trash pits. So it was also clear that nobody had lived permanently at Göbekli Tepe. Just before farming began not 100 miles away, hunter-gatherers joined forces at the site in times of abundance to construct an enormous ritual complex, most of which is underground. Today, there are 16 other megalith rings that are still buried across the 22-acre site, which is dated at about 9,500 to 9,000 BC, 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, and predating also pottery, metal, writing, and the wheel. Just as with our ancient cave-dwelling ancestors, the glimpses into the past we get from Göbekli Tepe are as revealing as they are obscure, and as awe-inspiring as they are mystifying. If there's anything we can say with certainty, it's this. Before farming and civilizations in our currently understood sense kicked off, our ancestors had serious reasons to go underground, and these very clearly were not survival-oriented, since what they took time to do with the equipment they had has never again been replicated. Ritual practice, quarrying, and the construction of huge, partially subterranean monuments lie at the basis of everything that comes afterwards. Now we're going to cover some of the earliest examples of underground construction and architecture from the ancient world, ranging from the early Bronze Age to the Classical era. There's a site of great earthen mounds in Ireland called County Meath. While it's 6,000 years down the road from Göbekli Tepe, it still outdates both Stonehenge and the Pyramids of Giza, as its construction date is estimated to have been around 3,200 BCE, over 5,000 years ago. The site has a clear ritual purpose and has been interpreted as an early remnant of the Druidic culture, religion, and processes of initiation and healing, which flourished across the British Isles and what's now France for thousands of years. The Druids were highly preoccupied with spiritual rebirth, and they emphasized the importance of returning to the womb of Mother Earth for this to occur. And as it turns out, the mounds at County Meath were not put up haphazardly, not at all. In each mound, a shaft leading to the sky above is oriented to the winter solstice sunrise, which fills the chamber with light at dawn. Initiates would likely sit in the darkness for extended periods of time before being reborn in the light, the end goal of the Druidic initiation techniques. What's remarkable is the astronomical and scientific understanding on techniques on display at Meath, along with the sophistication of the actual construction. Whatever the site may or may not have been used for, it reveals at the very least a striking and steadfast intention of the early indigenous Irish peoples to combine earthworks and astronomy with the aim of developing on the human experience of being underground or in the womb for spiritual, social, or perhaps health-related purposes. Now, if the early Irish people were preoccupied with rebirth and life, for the early Egyptians, the most important thing of all was the immortality of the soul after bodily death, or to put it simply, the afterlife. If the Egyptians didn't outright invent the practice of entombing the dead, they were certainly some of the most dedicated and serious about it. Egypt was famous all over the ancient world for their magnificent and awe-inspiring tombs, built with the purpose of assuring the kings and other VIPs of Egyptian society a safe passage through the underworld. The first pyramid was built in 2780 BCE and designed by King Dozer's architect, Imhotep. This followed more than 1,000 years of careful entombing using bench-shaped mounds called mastabas, and indeed, Imhotep's first pyramid design involved a careful stacking of 6 mastabas, smaller and smaller at each level, one on top of the other, to make a pyramid rising in steps. While that in itself was a major breakthrough in the history of Egyptian monumental architecture, it was just a tiny step in terms of what was to come. In 1279 BCE, the Egyptians built the tomb of Seti I in Abydos. the first pyramid to be wholly decorated and embellished, inside and out. One can only imagine how important the afterlife was in Egyptian society, for that much time, resources, and artistic meticulousness to be applied on such a huge scale. But the Egyptians weren't the only Neolithic to early Bronze Age societies to have a death preoccupation. On the island of Malta in the Mediterranean Sea, there exists an underground structure of prehistoric origins. It was discovered in 1902 by construction workers in the city of Paula, who were excavating cellars and foundations for new buildings. What they found was a 32-chamber complex containing the remains of an incredible number of people. 6,000 to 7,000 as it's estimated today. They were interred there with grave gifts of obsidian and flint tools, jewelry consisting of beads and stone pendants, and clay and stone figures of obese people and animals. It's called the Hamas-Israeli hypogeum, and it's believed to have been built in 2500 BCE. While some believe it began as a refuge, the thousands of human bones found inside its enigmatic rooms indicate that it was a burial complex of sorts. But it was probably something a little bit more significant than that. The Maltese Islands are famed for their massive prehistoric stone temples, with around 20 temple complexes found scattered all over, and most of them have 2 or 3 huge individual megalithic structures. Thanks to radiocarbon dating, we know these were built sometime between 3500 and 2500 BCE. But what's more striking than anything is the similarity between these temples and the hypogeum in architecture, sculptures, carvings, red dyes used, and the recurring figurines of animals and obese female figures. This has led many archaeologists to conclude that prehistoric Malta was characterized by a quite fanatical fertility cult. But what it points to is that in all probability, the hypogeum was a necropolis, a place to pay respects to the dead, perform death and afterlife rituals, and perhaps even sacrifices and offerings. But there are other features of the hypogeum which make it likely that it was much more than just a place to bury the dead. A carved hole in the wall exists in one of the chambers of the complex, deep down. It's called the oracle room, and when people speak into the hole in the wall, the voice is transformed into an echo that reverberates throughout the hypogeum. There are a few smaller chambers throughout the 3 levels of the complex that clearly gather up these echoes, and if you listen to the echoes from different parts of the hypogeum, you realize that these echoes are turned into something that sounds a lot like a heartbeat. And just like at County Meath, some shafts in the complex have a quite unusual alignment with the equinoctial sun. This is hard to dismiss as an accident. In a place filled with enormous stone carvings that rival those of Stonehenge in their enormity, and with ceilings so intricately carved with spirals and red dyes, which it's believed were imported from Sicily at the time. Over 1,000 years later, in 1200 BCE, archaeologists believe construction started at Chavin de Huantar, Peru, an ancient pilgrimage site which spans 130,000 square feet. It consists of terraces, squares, covered stone structures, and a sunken plaza, but that's not all. 3 layers of underground tunnels, ventilation shafts, chambers, and stone-lined galleries lay beneath the site, filled with carved obelisks and statues, displaying also a quite intricate and technically advanced construction of brickwork. In terms of this underground network alone, Chavin de Huantar is unmatched among South America's subterranean archaeological sites. Many features of the site relate it to ceremonial and cultural meanings associated with the ancient Andean religion. Radiocarbon dating of different parts of the site show that the biggest bulk of construction continued until 750 BCE, and that it continued to function as a ceremonial site until 500 BCE. But by the year 400, it seems that its religious functions had already ceased completely. It's remarkably difficult to piece together the historical events that underpin constructions like Meath, the Hypogeum of Malta, and Chavin de Huantar in Peru, not just because of how far back these sites go, but also because of how little literature there is on the subject from the period available to us for cross-referencing. Another issue faced time and time again by modern archaeology is the sloppy work done by early archaeologists, who often excavated artifacts with little concern for documentation of the specific layout of the site, such as the positionings of figurines, obelisks, statues, and other pieces of culturally specific material that could give us clues about the functions and meanings that went into these sites. It just so happens, though, that with the Mesopotamian civilizations, we know a lot more. There's an ancient site near modern-day Mosul in Iraq, whose ancient name was Kalu, or Nimrud. The earliest known settlement of this location dates back to 6000 BCE, but our best information on it goes back to the 8th and 9th centuries BCE, when it was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Just like the sites we've discussed, the network of temples and palaces existing in Nimrud, full of carved reliefs and gateway statues, have offered a treasure trove of clues on the Assyrian religion and mythology, their wars and historical dates, art and architecture, which we can finally compare with our picture of Assyria as it's presented in the classical and biblical texts. One of the most famous archaeological points of interest in Nimrud is the Northwest Palace. It was built under the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BCE. Its walls are lined with massive stone bas-reliefs, rock carvings into stone surfaces that produce three-dimensional iconography. These depict the king as well as divine protective imagery, mythological scenes, royal hunts, and achievements, and the wars waged by Assyrians. Some of the inscriptions and decorations even point to how the temples were actually constructed. One of the inscriptions shows the discovery of a local gypsum that had the necessary properties to be used for relief carving, and has thus come to be known as Mosul marble. But Babylonians and Assyrians weren't just using the underground for ritual and ceremonial purposes. While the monumental architecture of these early civilizations impresses us by its sheer scale, complexity, and artistic advancement, they also offer us some of the first examples of civil engineering in the ancient world. In Nimrud, we have the earliest known use of clay pipes and vaulted sewers made of burnt brick, that is, with fired clay. These watering sources were connected to private houses through bypass channels to the main sewers. Under buildings in Nimrud, archaeologists have found arched drain pipes leading to the subterranean sewer systems. In Baghdad, an old Babylonian city, archaeologists also found a subterranean channel made of bricks, a massive drainage ditch inscribed with the name of Nebuchadnezzar, a warrior king who reigned over the Neo-Babylonian Empire from 605 to 562 BCE and was known as the greatest military leader of his time. The tunnels and canals were added to the system over time by famous kings whose names were inscribed on new editions. In pioneering the river-fed systems of aqueducts, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, spanning roughly from 912 to 612 BCE, made shockwaves across the ancient world. The Neo-Assyrians clearly took some clues from the peoples of Persia, who had for a long time engaged in and perfected an underground water supply system called a qanat. The qanat was different from its successor, the aqueduct, in that it didn't use surface water such as lakes, rivers, or springs to feed into the system. Instead, the underground channels would transport water from deep underground wells and aquifers to the surface. It wasn't just useful as means of providing irrigation and a supply of drinking water, it was fundamental. Without this innovation, no life could have been sustained in the arid and inhospitable parts of current-day Iran where the technology took off. The Persians literally had a professional class of tunnelers called the muqannis, who were extraordinarily accomplished in their field. They would first identify what's called an alluvial fan, a deposit of sediments, gravel, minerals, and sand that would indicate to them the presence of groundwater below. Then they'd dig a mother well to reach the water table. Usually the mother well would go about 320 feet down, but the deepest recorded well goes a hair-raising 984 feet down. Once down there, the muqannis would check to verify that the aquifer had enough water to suit their purposes, and then they got straight to work. They plotted a course for the qanat from the mother well to the surface, taking into account the gradient of their downhill slope so that the water flow would remain constant and didn't stir up sediment or erode the tunnels. In the building process, ventilation shafts were dug out to guide the excavations, but also to let the workers breathe. The oldest qanat in existence is over 3,000 years old and about 44 miles long. It would be an understatement to say that qanat technology has withstood the test of time. All the way into the Middle Ages, qanats were built and used. From 831 to 1072 CE, when Sicily was under Arab rule and Palermo was the capital of the Emirate of Sicily, muqannis were brought in to equip the city with the not-so-latest innovation. The warm wind coming from the Sahara, the Sirocco, has always caused dusty, dry conditions on the island, and so having reliable water supply as well as getting respite from the heat were always important needs to be met for the people living there. The success was overwhelming and made the Arab occupation of Palermo one of the most transformative dominations the island had endured, turning the capital city into a thriving landscape with a stunning network of lush gardens encircling the city, fed by waters from the mountains. The most famous qanat in existence today is certainly Qanat Firaun, which means in Arabic, Canal of the Pharaoh, or the Pharaoh's watercourse. Ironically, it doesn't seem to have had much to do with the Egyptians. It was rather the Romans who built it, between 90 and 210 CE, adopting the ancient Iranian technology of their ever-growing empire. Its capital, Gadara, was home to 50,000 people, and it was in many ways a key cultural hub of the region at the time. Home to many scholars, writers, artists, philosophers, and poets alike, the excavations total out to 105 miles of underground channels, making it by far the longest built structure of antiquity, and a mind-blowing feat of hydroengineering. When it was completed, Gadara had been turned upside down. Suddenly, in a city used to often serious water privation, there were thousands of fountains, drinking troughs, and thermal baths. Roman senators refreshed themselves in private pools and decorated their gardens with cooling grottos. By some estimates, the resulting water supply and consumption was over 132 gallons per capita. Bear in mind that a typical bathtub can hold 40 to 70 gallons of water. But the qanat technology had begun to influence other urban cultures a long time before the Romans put it to such extravagant use at Gadara. Jerusalem, a city that goes back at least to the 3rd millennium BCE and enters the historic sources in the 2nd millennium, was a choice city because it was naturally fortified by the deep Kidron Valley to the east, the Hagai Valley to the west, and the lowland between these two to the south. Only the north was unprotected and vulnerable to attack. As is stated in the biblical passages, "And from the north shall come the evil." Even more complicated for the peoples living in Jerusalem was, you guessed it, the water supply. Israel has at least since the Bronze Age been recorded as a dry land, and the peoples who sustained themselves were always paying attention to their closest water source. Now, the only permanent water source of ancient Jerusalem was called the Gihon Spring. Its name, Gihon, comes from Hebrew, Giha, meaning eruption, and points to the fact that the spring didn't flow steadily but came out in random bursts of flow, with periods of stagnation in between. Now, as Gihon Spring flowed, and still flows, out of the ground from the foot of the hill of Jerusalem in the bed of the Kidron Brook, the problem of water access in times of war or siege becomes quite a problem for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, who were clustered up on top of the naturally fortified hill. Of course, the city wall was built in the middle of the slope, where it could best hold off invaders. So, in times of peace, the inhabitants could descend down to the spring to obtain their water supplies. But in times of war, the city's only water supply was catastrophically located outside the city. With all the myths and fables of classical and ancient texts, it's hard enough for us to understand who would have carried out innovations to solve Jerusalem's water supply problem, or even how many different times that could have happened. After all, Jerusalem has been conquered more than 40 times, with over 100 battles being fought for control of this city over the course of its history. But there are coincidences that are well worth our attention. In the 19th century, a British researcher named Charles Warren discovered a shaft underneath Jerusalem, a diagonal tunnel hewn in the bedrock along a natural crack. At its end was a deep horizontal shaft, at the end of which Warren guessed water jugs could be lowered down to the Gihon Spring below. He proposed that it had been built around 1800 BCE and abandoned at some time in the 8th century BCE, when the 1,800-foot Hezekiah's Tunnel was dug to carry water from the spring to a protected spot on the western side of the city. The shaft was named the Warren Shaft after the man who rediscovered it, and it sheds light into an early attempt by the inhabitants of Jerusalem to make their city safe from invasions inside and out. There's one tragic problem, however. In the biblical story about the capture of Jerusalem by King David, which occurred in the 10th century BCE, we're told that the battle was won decisively with a tactic relying on something called the sinar. The full meaning of the word isn't exactly clear, but experts have translated it as a gutter tunnel and water conduit. If Warren's tunnel really is the biblical Sinor, then it is both the shaft built by the inhabitants of Jerusalem to secure the water supply for siege warfare in 1800 BCE, and the very tunnel with which Jerusalem was finally besieged by King David's men 800 years later. A siege so easy after the cunning infiltration that some sources call it a bloodless one. Although it's terribly ironic, we can't dismiss the inhabitants of Bronze and Iron Age Jerusalem as inept or unsophisticated. It required exceptional engineering capability to bring external water from springs and runoffs into the city, and the city's Iron Age aqueduct and qanat-style designs are some of the most impressive and complicated of the ancient world. In fact, the tunnel that brought water from the Gihon spring into the city culminated in a great pool protected by a massive fortress. There's also archaeological evidence for a pipe system designed to discharge the sewers of the city down into the Kidron Valley, keeping the northeastern part of the city clean and irrigated. Some of these pipes are massive, further leading credence to the biblical tales. Some of the irrigation channels are over a half-meter wide and around 2 meters high, with vaulted ceilings and worked stone brickwork. If there's anything to take away from these old histories, it's that the underground can work just as well to your advantage as it can against. Let's go to Cappadocia now, a region of modern-day Turkey that has awed archaeologists since the discipline's birth. There are around 200 underground cities cut into the volcanic rock landscapes of Cappadocia, making it one of the strangest and fascinating regions of the world to study the ancient connections between the underground and human culture. Some speculate that the underground cities, each with an elaborate network of tunnels and some even connecting to each other, were created as refuges for times of war and invasion. Others speculate that they were used to store food and water, making it even more likely that they were used as hideouts of some sort. But even if they were created solely for this purpose, the actual scale of the underground works makes it absolutely clear that the peoples who inhabited this landscape were in no way unfamiliar with the underground, tunneling, and the construction of suitable subterranean environments for whole populations. Derinkuyu is perhaps the most famous of the underground cities of Cappadocia, due to its sheer vastness and meticulous design. Its interior has a whopping 18 stories, and taken altogether, Derinkuyu has by any standard a self-contained metropolis boasting ventilation shafts, wells, kitchens, schoolrooms, oil presses, bathhouses, a winery, and living space for up to 20,000 people. What's more, when threatened by an attack, each level of the underground city could be sealed off behind a pair of monolithic stone doors. Historians date the construction of Derinkuyu to about 800 BCE and believe that the Hittites or the Phrygians were among its earliest builders. Later on, evidence of occupation and expansion by many other groups, including the Byzantine-era Christians, comes to us in the form of scores of frescoes and chapels. Amazingly enough, Derinkuyu was totally unknown until the 1960s when a local Turkish man renovating his home basement broke through one of his walls and discovered the unfathomably huge complex. Unlike Derinkuyu, some subterranean cities don't stay lost, and with every epoch become repurposed and reused. One of those examples, in Italy, is the city carved deep into the volcanic rock bluff in which sits Orvieto. It began with the great ancient Etruscan civilization, after whom the Tyrrhenian Sea is named, who were very well known in antiquity as a major trading power and a people richly endowed with mineral resources. They existed from around 900 BCE to 28 BCE, when Rome conquered and assimilated them. One of their most important settlements was the city of Velsna, which, like Orvieto, most likely sat on the volcanic bluff as an ideal position to withstand sieges. And like Jerusalem, the ancient Etruscans lacked a water source high up on their hill. The nearest one was down on the plains below the bluff. So just as the ancient Persians and inhabitants of Jerusalem did, the Etruscans did the only thing available to them. They sunk well down into the volcanic perch, building chambers and cisterns into the mountain to collect and channel rainwater, a subterranean construction project that would continue for the next 2,500 years, growing to eventually comprise 1,200 interlocking tunnels, grottos, and galleries. Though it was used as recently as the Second World War by locals as bomb shelters, the underground city still bears traces of its ancient past. Even today, Etruscan sanctuaries and medieval olive presses can be found within the staggeringly intricate complex, as well as Greek pottery, coins, jewelry, ornaments, and building decorations. During archaeological excavations, an inscription was found in one of the sanctuaries. It read, "The Heavenly Place." This was a huge finding for experts of Etruscan civilization, since the legendary Fanum Voltumne, or Etruscan sanctuary of Vertumna, was well known as the most important site and federal sanctuary of the ancient League of the 12 Etruscan cities. Each year, this landmark was the meeting place for the royals of each city, in a great festival and gathering. As excavation continued, more temples were found, indicating that the complex underneath ancient Velsna was indeed the location of the Fanum Voltumne, or Shrine of Voltumna, as translated from Latin. Voltumna was an underworld deity and supreme god of the Etruscan pantheon, and importantly, Fanum can more precisely be translated as sacred place than as shrine, because for the ancient Etruscans, and in most of the references to their cultic, religious, and political center in the classical literature, everything points to the Fanum Voltumne as being much more than a single temple. Here we come to the blurring of needs-based technological innovations and the strange political and social architectures of the ancient world, a matter archaeologists are well familiar with, but which for us moderns can seem stupefying and hopelessly confusing. Another ancient example is Petra, a town in southern Jordan that was an ancient caravan city. By the evidence gathered, it has been inhabited since prehistory and peaked in population and architectural achievement around 2,000 years ago, in around 200 CE, when the ancient Nabetians hand-chiseled the surrounding sandstone hillsides into a complex of tombs, temples, and banquet halls, with tunnels carved into the sandstone cliffs. The city may have been home to around 20,000 people during this period, and by the looks of it, was largely abandoned by the 7th century of our current era. One of the most impressive buildings is called the Al-Khazne, or the Treasury. It has an ornamental facade that extends 130 feet up a rock face. Petra remained unknown and undiscovered to Europeans until the 1800s, and today, with excavations still ongoing, it's estimated by some that the vast majority of its ruins may still lurk underground. As the classical age took off under the influences of the Greek and then Roman empires, underground civil engineering continued to move forward in leaps and bounds. What's fascinating about our ancient ancestors isn't just the dedication with which they put themselves to work, but the longevity of construction that they were committed to. As countless historians have described it, planned obsolescence was totally non-existent concept in the ancient world. When things were built, they were built to last. Herodotus, well known as the father of history as a scholarly discipline, is one of our best sources on the achievements of the ancients. He described the famous underground labyrinth of Egypt, which to this day remains unrecovered. He also had a great praise for the works of the Greek people of Samos, writing in 440 BCE that one of their greatest works of all was a tunnel under a hill 150 fathoms high, carried entirely through the base of the hill, with a mouth at either end. The length of the tunnel he's describing is over 4,600 feet in length, with a width and height of 8 by 8 feet. Along the tunnel is another trough, 30 feet deep and 3 feet broad, through which water was piped from an abundant source deep underground and straight into the city of Samos, which in the time of his writing had a population of 300,000 people. The architect of the creation was Eupolinus, and it's therefore known today as the Tunnel of Eupolinos, the Eupolinian Aqueduct, or more generally, the Aqueduct of Samos, although its design makes its influence more likely to be from the qanat technology than anything else. According to Herodotus, the city didn't have a source of water that could be accessed when the fortified city was put under siege by enemies, a story you're probably getting familiar with by now. And for this reason, Herodotus claims the most famous hydraulic work of ancient Greece was built. Admired and renowned in antiquity, construction seems to have started in 530 BCE and lasted 10 years. It was done by two working groups who entered the mountain from opposite sides and bored into the mountain towards each other, aiming for the channel right in its heart. One working team encountered unstable soil and had to make a deviation of over 656 feet from the straight line through which the two groups were meant to connect with each other. Unlike the Persians, the Greeks in this situation didn't have the means to dig vertical ventilation shafts to guide their tunneling efforts. And yet somehow, the working groups still managed to meet in the center of the channel, with a deviation or standard error of only 23 inches, having just excavated 24,720 cubic feet from the mountain. A mind-blowing feat. It appears that the tunnel, the first subterranean construction of the kind to use a geometry-based approach, was used for an entire millennium following this, going out of use in the 7th century CE. And it wasn't until 1856 that this structure was discovered, when Victor Guérin, a French intellectual, explorer, and amateur archaeologist, went looking for it, basing himself solely off the text written by Herodotus 2,300 years before him. In the same century as the Samians' historic achievement, the Romans undertook their own monumental subterranean construction. It came to be called the Cloaca Maxima, or the Great Sewer of ancient Rome. Today, it's the best-known ancient large-scale urban underground tunnel system, and it still functions today as it was designed. Even after 2,500 years of use, its construction seems to have spanned from 600 to 500 BCE under two Etruscan kings of Rome. As you know by now, the Etruscans, far from beginners in underground adventures, had already carved out a massive interior underneath Velsna, and were still 600 years away from their final dissolution under the wrathful Roman Empire's conquests. Indeed, the construction of the Cloaca Maxima predates both the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic. Not all of the feats of Rome were done by the Romans we tend to think about. Standing at an approximate length of 1,742 feet with a typical cross-section of 9 by 12 feet, the Cloaca Maxima is described by many experts as the earliest application of the arch in Rome. Its purpose was to transport floodwaters out of the city following terrible storms, and also for land reclamation purposes, most commonly in the draining of swamps to undertake new constructions on stable ground. It was also the start of the cut-and-cover method of tunneling in urban environments, a technique in which the builders would cut a trench out of the ground and then build an arched tunnel over it to cover the trench, thus restoring the surface ground to its original state. The combination of cut-and-cover and vaulted arch construction, pioneered with the Cloaca Maxima, became the basic format in the 19th century for the modern adoption of aqueducts and qanat-like structures, as well as innovations such as train tunnels and subways, showing just how much our modern world and privileges owe to the historic breakthroughs of our classical forebears. The Cloaca Maxima was instantly recognized as a great public work, but more importantly, it laid the foundation for Rome as an urban center capable of enduring the course of history, population growth, and urban densification. It became the spine and skeletal system of ancient Rome, determining the growth and afflorescence of urban Rome, giving it a specific imprint by defining its shape and boundaries, along with more obvious walls and gates surrounding the city. It also established major traffic routes and enabled cultivation of the plains between the hills and the river Tiber. But the Cloaca's construction was no small feat, and would go on to be referenced for centuries by the great Roman writers and statesmen. Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic, who took part in the expulsion of the royal house in 509 BCE and the culmination of the period of the patriarchs, didn't have the kindest words about the sacrifices involved in the construction process. In a speech to the people of Rome, and looking to distance himself from the just overthrown political structure, he said, "He compelled you, like slaves, to lead a miserable life, hewing stone, cutting wood, carrying enormous loads, and passing your lives underground." Over 500 years later, in 77 CE, Pliny the Elder wrote about the many works of the Cloaca project who committed suicide to avoid the arduous labor. And yet, Pliny wasn't totally opposed to the result, saying also in praise of the structure, "The ground is shaken by earth tremors, but in spite of all, for 700 years from the time of the Tarquinius Priscus, the channels have remained well-nigh impregnable." Historians today still agree with this verdict, some going so far as to say that no public work ever done in Rome surpasses in utility the Tarquinian sewers, for they rendered all the future possible. If the Cloacae are, as they have been called, a monument of tyranny, they are also a monument of statesmanship. We can appreciate today, just by pondering the work, the amount of sacrifice that was involved, and not just the part of the huge pool of laborers doing the backbreaking work. The people living next to the site also had sacrifices to make, as they were exposed to dust, dirt, and very likely an ear-shattering environment during most of their lives. And yet, as with Pliny and the modern historians, we have to appreciate the effect of the work and the revolution it represents for cities as such a scale of Rome in the ancient world. For instance, in Pompeii, a contemporary city of ancient Rome, the inhabitants simply placed stepping stones at street intersections to avoid stepping in sewage when crossing the streets. And just like in medieval age Europe, most of the people got rid of their feces by simply tossing it out into the streets with the rest of the sewage, where it would hopefully get discharged into channels, drain pipes, and ditches. It couldn't have smelled like lavender and roses. Meanwhile, the Romans had the cloaca, and not just for storms and drainage, and to prevent flooding. In fact, they increasingly used the cloaca to discharge human and animal waste, thus multiplying the uses of the innovative sewer system. But before we get too enamored with the Romans' achievement, remember that the ancient engineers of the Cloaca Maxima hadn't taken this repurposing into account, and neither had they constructed a system capable of retaining sewer gas. Indeed, the Roman population was constantly exposed to this noxious evaporation due to the lack of cutoff devices which today, and thankfully, grace our sewer systems. In the 1st century before Christ, the Romans decided to have another crack at something big. This time, they wanted to change the experience of the city itself and expand its possibilities in terms of leisure and transport. So they applied the cut-and-cover technique in combination with vaulted underground passages again and came up with something called the Cryptoporticus. Essentially, the Cryptoporticus worked as a system of covered and connected passageways with vaulted corridors, allowing citizens to move through the hot city in a cooler and shaded environment. The Cryptoporticus featured in many cities of the Roman Empire. In Syrian cities, they moved parallel to the streets, placed just beneath the pavement, while in France, Portugal, and Turkey, they more frequently lined platforms and terraces, connecting major buildings and functioning as ambulatories with windows cut into the upper sides of the vaults on one side for lighting. Today, the Cryptoporticus tunnels are still in use as vehicular highways and pedestrian thoroughfares. And as we'll discover down the course of history, the first railroad tunnels and subways were a little more than a Cryptoporticus with tracks laid inside. The Romans continued to experiment with above and underground architecture, creating some of the most fascinating spaces in the ancient world, sometimes providing us more mysteries than answers to our questions. The Basilica di San Clemente was built in Rome in the year 99 of our Common Era, in honor of Pope St. Clemente. It doesn't appear especially extravagant on the outside, though it bears on its unadorned facade the multi-layered reflection of Rome's turbulent religious history, while the inside was lavishly decorated in the 12th century and contains one of the largest collections of medieval frescoes in Rome today. There is more to the Basilica of St. Clemente than meets the eye, or should we say the ground. Underneath the basilica is a lower church, perhaps also a basilica, which dates to the 4th century and appears to have itself constructed over an old Roman noblewoman's residence. While this testifies to the literal building up of cities in time, it also brings our attention to possible esoteric spaces of Roman life, where cults would conduct their ceremonies outside of the limelight. In fact, the old noblewoman's residence beneath the lower basilica, apparently destroyed in the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, very clearly seems to have been put back into use by members of the cult of Mithras, who the space was turned into a Mithraium by creating vaulted ceilings decorated with stars that evoke the night sky, a niche for the statue of Mithras, and a representation of him slaying the bull, a key icon of Mithraism. Let's back up a moment and clarify what all this means. Mithras was a Persian solar deity whose cult, the Mithraic cult, spread all over the ancient world. And Romans, before Christianity, and just like the Greeks who also traded and traveled far and wide, benefited from an extraordinary fusion of currents and cultures. One of these vibrant subcultures was the Mithraic cults, who would come together underground in Mithraea to perform their cultic ceremonies, rites, and rituals. Mithraism had such an influence on Roman culture and religious movements by the 1st century after Christ that some ancient sources even claim that one of the cruelest Roman leaders on the record, Nero, was even initiated to its rites. In 1912, archaeologists were carrying out excavations at the world-famous Roman baths of Caracalla when they discovered the largest Mithraeum that has yet to be found. As with all Mithraea, it's underground, covering an impressive 2,475 square feet. Most of the hall's artwork has been destroyed by the passage of time. Only a few relief sculptures and inscriptions are preserved. The most intriguing remnant, which offers us a startling view into the practices and initiations of Mithraic cults of Roman times, is a deep pit called a fossa sanguinis, into which it's believed initiates were lowered into to be baptized by the blood of a slaughtered bull. If that makes you see Mithraism as a kind of classical fanatic movement, you'd in many ways be wrong, since the Christian religion, which the Romans took up officially with Constantine's edict in 1313, shared many aspects with the Mithra god, whose birthday was celebrated by Romans on the 25th of December. Mithraism also placed a great emphasis on the idea of life after death, resurrection, as well as the final judgment, a conceptual scheme which very likely both Christianity and the original Persian worshippers of Mithras took from the Egyptian judgment before Osiris, a trial that awaited everyone in the netherworld's Hall of the Two Truths. But while the Mithraic worshippers were quick to repurpose the old noblewoman's subterranean chambers, such repurposing work didn't always happen so fast. Sometimes centuries passed before the spaces were taken up again for new use. Such is the case with the underground city near Naours in northern France, which includes 2 miles of tunnels and 300 man-made rooms, all of which lay 100 feet below a forested plateau. It began in the 3rd century AD as part of a Roman quarry and was expanded much later in the Middle Ages, by locals using it as a hiding place during the many wars and invasions of the period. But if those locals found a simple quarry, they sure didn't leave it that way. Inside, there's space for up to 3,000 inhabitants, and the system is replete with chapels, wells, bakeries, and even stables. Then they were sealed off for decades, before in the 19th century being reopened as a tourist attraction. And they again became popular in the 20th century, when soldiers heading to the Battle of the Somme stopped by to check it out. Today, visitors can see over 2,000 works of graffiti left behind by Allied soldiers. As you can probably see by now, there's a nearly endless variation to the working, repurposing, and cultural life of underground works. Here's another one. In Istanbul, there's a subterranean water storage facility called the Basilica Cistern, or Sunken Palace in Turkish, which exists for quite strange reasons. It's the only remaining structure of an important network of buildings during late antique Constantinople, which is to say Istanbul, from the 5th century on. It gets its name from the basilica once located above it, which was built in the 4th or early 5th century CE. It had a courtyard surrounded with porticos and was connected with significant buildings like the Library of Constantinople and the Octagon, where cases were tried in Old Constantinople. The basilica burned down in 476 and was immediately rebuilt. Then, during the 532 CE Nika riot in Constantinople, the Roman Emperor Justinian commissioned its rebuilding. This time, they added a cistern beneath the building as they remade it, probably between 527 and 541, just before the new basilica was finished. Now, this cistern was no average-sized cistern. It was a massive, open-air cistern which drew from nearby aqueducts and could be relied on to get through the water shortages which frequently occurred in Constantinople during the summers. The underground chamber is about 453 feet by 213 feet with an area of 105,000 square feet and a ridiculous water-holding capacity of 2.8 million cubic feet. The cistern's arched roof is supported by 336 carved marble columns, each one of which is 30 feet tall and intricately engraved. According to the records, Justinian had 7,000 slaves work on the reconstruction of the ancient building. Today, there are only a few feet of water present, but it's believed that it provided water long ago to the first hill of Constantinople's structures, most notably the Great Palace of Constantinople. Eventually, the cathedral-sized cistern's existence fell out of memory, and only local inhabitants of Constantinople who regularly drew water from it could take you there. It re-entered the limelight in 1565, however, when the French traveler Petrus Gillius wrote of it, describing how he rode in between the mighty columns and the fish he saw swimming in the water around him. Now, you're probably wondering at what point tunneling and underground engineering was used for the purposes of warfare and city sieges, but it's not so easy to set an exact date. We know, for example, based on Assyrian carvings, that engineering units operating in the reign of Sargon of Akkad, an old Assyrian king who reigned from 2334 to 2279 BCE, used tunneling strategies to undermine the walls of enemy cities, which tells us that the practice is indeed very, very old. Everybody knows the ancient city of Troy by name, ever since its siege by the Greeks in 1250 BCE was immortalized by Homer 2 centuries later in his epic poem The Iliad. The most famous incident brought up and the decisive factor to win the battle was the Trojan horse, one of the greatest and mythic deceptions in ancient history. Homer makes no mention of tunneling operations by the besieging troops, but curiously enough, archaeological excavations at the site, believed to be the ancient city of Troy, show numerous subterranean passages crossing underneath the city's walls, which possibly could have been used as part of the assault. By the time we get into the Classical Age and the Roman conquests, a barrage of evidence points to the tunnels as a major factor in siege warfare particularly. The Romans quickly mastered the technique of tunneling beneath enemy walls of a city to force a breach of fortifications, creating spaces beneath the built walls of the fortress, propping these up with wood, and then lighting the wood on fire. This could considerably speed up the process of a siege for the Romans, who were used to blockading a city until a surrender could be forced, with the enemy's lifelines running out. The only issue was, in mastering the technique of tunneling, the Romans created one of the most powerful techniques of counterinsurgencies in the history of warfare: counter-tunneling. An early example we have of this comes from the ancient Roman historian Polybius, whose account of the fierce siege of the Greek city of Ambracia notes that as soon as the Greeks noticed the huge mounds of earth outside the city, their commanders got straight to work digging a trench inside their fortified wall and parallel to it. What the Greeks did next is still being used, of course in a slightly different way today. They placed brazen vessels made very thinly in a row at the bottom of the trench, as close to the wall as possible. Using these pieces of metal, they listened for the noise of digging as it reverberated through the earth, and got amplified by the vessels. Thus, with great sensitivity, they were able to roughly triangulate the direction in which the Romans were approaching underground, and calculated to perfection how to hit their enemy's tunnel. This is the first, and not at all the last, example of acoustics to detect enemy tunnels. And it's one of the first examples of chemical warfare too, since the Greeks, once they dug into the Roman tunnels, proceeded to burn chicken feathers, well known back then to produce toxic smoke, to rat out the Romans from their own tunnels and force the siege back above ground. It's also not the last time the Romans got caught out at their own game. During the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 to 70 CE, the embattled and persecuted Jewish people fled into more than 450 cave systems in the Holy Land, digging into mountainsides to hide and launch guerrilla attacks on the Roman legionnaires. The Romans would face this again in their fight on the Rhine and Danube frontiers of Europe, against Germanic tribes who dug trenches connected by tunnels, and from these ambushed the unsuspecting Roman soldiers. But that's not all. Even on the defense, the Romans faced some of the most versatile and cunning tactics. During the Persian Empire's siege of the Roman city, Dura Euthropos, in 256 CE, the tunneling Persians, who descended into the ground 130 feet away from the city's walls, using, of all places, Dura's underground necropolis as a starting point, discovered a Roman counter-tunnel. What the Persians then did was fill the Roman tunnel with pitch and sulfur and set it on fire to asphyxiate the soldiers within. The archaeological evidence from the site shows crystals of bitumen in the tunnel. a naturally occurring tar-like petrochemical which would have made the fire fast and hot. It might have been such a brutal tactic that some archaeologists believed the Persian soldier found at the end of the tunnel clutching his throat was the one to pull the trigger and face the fatal backfiring of chemical warfare. But the Romans weren't always on the losing hand of tunneling. Far from it. Many legends recount that some cities under blockade by the Romans would surrender as soon as they noticed piles of freshly dug dirt in the surrounding area. Such was the fear that Roman siege tunneling could induce in enemies. Such tactics as these, used by the Assyrians and Greeks, Persians and Romans, Jewish peoples and Germanic tribes, never really went out of style. Thousands of years later, during the French siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1203, a castle built by the English king Richard the Lionhearted, French soldiers attempting to undermine the fortifications of the castle kept hitting the stout defensive walls cleverly put into place, well underground by King Richard. But that all changed when they broke into an unguarded toiled chute that emptied into a chapel inside the castle. The French soldiers climbed the chute, and the defenders of the Chateau Gaillard, taken by surprise, stood no chance at all. But the Classical Age gave way to the Middle Ages. People continued to build underground wonders, rather than merely switch to the underground for insurgencies or sieges. In the 14th century CE, the Vijayanagara Empire's capital city of Hampi was the second most populous in the world after Beijing, and by the accounts left by Persian and European travelers, it was heavily fortified, prosperous, and wealthy. Yet, strangely enough, this booming center of the Eastern world went out of collective memory for 400 years after its abandonment. Only in the 1980s did archaeologists discover the massive temple complex they'd created, including its most famous temple, the underground Temple of Shiva, which, though still largely submerged and mystifying, has still offered to us many carvings, sculptures, and murals for analysis, and its inner sanctuary has a hall full of massive pillars which are carved exquisitely and reach all the way to the roof. During the First Crusade, a monastic order known as the Hospitaller Knights, dedicated to the treatment of the sick and injured, constructed the Knights' Halls in Acre, Israel, a port city and entrance to the Holy Land. A large complex, part of the Hospitaller Citadel, it was cleverly constructed beneath the castle prison of Acre. It consists of a dining room, many interconnected halls, a dungeon, and an old Gothic church. In 1187, when the conquering Muslim army took back the Holy Land from the Crusaders, the site was largely destroyed, only to be reconstructed during the Second Crusade. Today, only 53,819 square feet of this three-story archaeological treasure have been dug up. Who knows how much is left to be discovered? In the 12th century CE, a devout king of Ethiopia ordered the construction of 11 Christian churches in Lalibela, with the aim of creating what would come to be known as New Jerusalem. And he too decided the underground wouldn't make the worst place to start. An unbelievable feat of architecture and a technical masterclass, the New Jerusalem was fashioned from the top down, with each of its churches being carved out from the volcanic rock below the Earth's surface, and then hollowed out. This made the churches look like they were growing out of the ground. One of these, the Church of St. George, was literally cut from a single monolithic slice of stone inside a trench that was 100 feet deep. It was then connected to the rest of the complex via a network of underground passages, hidden caves, and catacombs. The legend has it that Lalibela took 24 years to build, but historians believe it was completed in phases over several centuries. Today, the site is still sacred to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and its underground places of worship draw as many as 100,000 pilgrims every year. Another underground marvel coming up from deep underground, the Wieliczka salt mine in Poland. Located on the outskirts of the modern-day capital, Krakow, it's an enormous subterranean complex of rooms, passageways, and statues dating back to the 12th century, just like Lalibela. The difference, though, is that originally, miners went down to create this complex looking for rock salt. As the centuries progressed, the mine slowly expanded into a warren of galleries and tunnels that extend over a kilometer down into the earth. Using the naturally occurring salt crystal deposits in the mine, the workers went on to build chapels, chandeliers, statues, and bas-reliefs. There's even a detailed replica of Da Vinci's Last Supper down there. All this has earned a new nickname, the Underground Salt Cathedral. And like Lalibela, this operation went on for over 700 years, finally putting down its initial purpose of producing salt in 2007. Today, it's still a popular tourist attraction in Poland, and it's also home to a health spa that touts the therapeutic properties of the mine's salt-rich microclimate. Who knows, maybe it was a much more healthy environment than Rome during the Cloacas construction. A couple hundred years after Lalibela and the Velitska salt mine, all the way in the Andean Mountains, the Incan Empire built the now world-famous mountain city of Machu Picchu. It was said to be built for the Incan emperor Pachacutec, and it has quite innovative running water and drainage systems. A now very commonly known piece of construction, Machu Picchu was in fact only discovered in 1911 by a professor who was wandering through the steep and treacherous area. But it's no surprise the Incas were capable of such a feat. Evidence shows that they had an extensive network of tunnels going straight through the Andes Mountains, used for transporting people and goods between different regions of the empire. And of course, their road system, which was critical for maintaining communication and for trading, made very frequent use of tunnels, which also massively cut their travel times. And yet, sometimes there are subterranean works, even spanning very diverse regions, that remain inscrutable to our modern eyes. In a number of European countries, for instance, there are a number of passages of which about 2,000 have been found, and since their discovery have seemed to evade explanation altogether. They're called Erdstall tunnels, from the German word meaning earth stable or mining tunnel, and they're grouped together due to their narrow and ovular shape, their vertical or horizontal alignments, and some incredibly tight passages, sometimes only a few feet tall by a few feet wide. While earthenworks, they're unmistakably man-made, since some of them have crudely shaped benches in their terminus or end rooms, which are often not much more than a dead end. They also frequently feature schluffs, or slip-outs, tight holes that act as transition points between portions of passages dug at lower and higher elevations. They're so claustrophobic and uncomfortable that anyone passing through would be required to contort and squeeze themselves just to make it through the next section. Another very strange feature of Erdstall tunnels, they have only one point of entry and exit, which is usually tucked away in old settlements and sometimes simply masked in the deep wilderness. This made airflow through the tunnels practically non-existent. While historians think these were probably made during the Middle Ages, going as far back to the 12th century, the fact that they were simply carved out of the earth and are usually almost totally barren of artifacts makes it quite tedious to give these tunnels a specific date. The historical record is of no help at all either, since no accounts exist anywhere telling of their construction. If only the Middle Ages had had a Herodotus of their own. The tunnels might have been used for storage purposes, but the narrow slip passages, which oftentimes are below the waterline, makes this a foolish hypothesis as the risk of flooding would surely make it a bad choice for valuables. Could they have been used as refuges in times of war or invasions? This hypothesis too has been put forward on several occasions, since the entries are sometimes very well concealed. But the single entry feature of Erdstall tunnels would make these essentially earthen coffins for anyone caught hiding in there. And an enemy's ability to cut off the air supply from the outside makes the theory highly implausible. The tunnels, which are most frequently found in Bavaria and Austria, can nonetheless be found all the way over to the west on the British Isles and in France, leading some theorists to claim that they had a spiritual purpose akin to the incubation practiced by the priests of Apollo in ancient Greece, and the cave-frequenting cults of Pan and Cybele, which came to Greece from Persia. In Austrian folklore, the tunnels were built by goblins, and some locals talk of them as hideouts for demons and dark spirits. Others describe them as way stations for the deceased. All of this seems to further support the spiritual explanation. One problem, however, is that when historians and archaeologists are stumped over their findings, they often resort to the religious or spiritual explanation without finding much basis for their claims other than the inability to think of other purposes. Nevertheless, the slip-outs have been likened by some experts to symbolic birth canals, the implication being that the tunnels could have served as locations of ceremonial rebirth for people looking to rid themselves of disease, sickness, or even guilt. This does have a lot in common with the Druidic initiation practices, in which initiates would be taken deep into caves and left there for days, only to be retrieved and to be taken back into the light of day to be reborn. But as we've seen in Comith, Ireland, thousands of years before Erstalls were presumably constructed, the indigenous peoples were already fashioning mounds to perform these kinds of ceremonial activities, mounds which possessed astronomical alignments of extraordinary precision. One would wonder then how such a widespread tradition could have been effaced, or whether it had gone underground for centuries, perhaps following the Roman Empire's forays into Gaul and the British Isles, and the Dark Ages in which Christianity spread its roots firmly and forcefully. We can speculate as much as we want, but until further evidence comes to light, the Erdstalls remain as mysterious as ever. Before getting into the last and explosive innovations to tunnel warfare which have emerged in the modern age, it's worth at least pointing out that in terms of design and construction methods, the so-called innovations from the modern world actually owe a lot to the groundbreaking innovations we've seen so far from the ancient world. During the 19th century Industrial Revolution, the Anglo-Saxons in particular looked to Roman examples from antiquity for inspiration. History, it seems, doesn't always follow the straightest of lines, but the engineers weren't entirely wrong in looking to the Roman examples, since the structures in question withstood the ravages of time unlike many, many structures built since. Engineers, rightly so, wanted to build things that would fulfill functional uses for thousands of years. The only advantage they had against the ancient Romans was their supply of explosives, which they could use to dig a trench more quickly. One of the first American railroads to be constructed using explosives, the New York Harlem River Railroad Tunnel, was built in 1837. With gunpowder, it was blasted through the extremely tough rock of northern Manhattan to form the trunk of what is now the MTA, Metro North Railroad, and connects upstate New York with Grand Central Station. At first, it was the world's first horse-drawn streetcar operation. The Mount Prospect Tunnel is still in constant use today, containing the Metro North Center express tracks under Park Avenue and 92nd through 94th Street. By the 1830s and 1840s, New Yorkers were beginning to feel the need to address the lack of clean water in Manhattan, which resulted in uncontrollable fires, disease outbreaks due to contaminated wells, and because of this, a series of epidemics that devastated the city. A particularly vicious outbreak in 1832 highlighted the vulnerabilities of life in overcrowded cities. In those times, sanitation was far from the top of politicians' priorities, and medical science hadn't even yet recognized the role of germs and disease. But cities were growing much faster in population than in the knowledge of what made them safe places for living and working in. Though the New Yorkers of the time who sat down to design the Croton Aqueduct in response to these growing issues might not have known it, this was a problem that had affected rulers and engineers alike since at least the ancient Assyrians and Sumerians of Mesopotamia, and the Persians of ancient Iran too. But what these public-minded citizens did know was the concept of the underground vaulted passageway. So the aqueduct they built to convey water from Westchester County to Manhattan was designed just like the ancient Roman Cloaca Maxima, as well as the Cryptoporticus, with a large cross-section of 7.5 by 9 feet. 2 years later, the underground vaulted passageway came back yet again to suit the needs of a city rapidly encountering problems of vehicular and pedestrian traffic, conflict, and delays. To make the technological jump from the ancient Cryptoporticus to the modern urban subway, the builders of the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel in the city of Brooklyn, using the cut-and-cover method, manual tools, and other relatively unsophisticated equipment, took 7 months to create the mile-and-a-half-long first official transportation subway track in the world. They built the tunnel specifically to attain what's called grade separation for the Long Island Railroad, whose trains lack the brake capacity to operate on city streets. Grade separation is the concept in civil engineering of aligning junctions of 2 or more surface transport axes at different heights so that traffic can flow uninterrupted on the various transit routes as they cross each other. It might sound simple enough to us today, but back then, this was revolutionary, even if technically there wasn't much to it that was actually new. Now back to the modern world. still full of wars, insurgencies, and resistances, we'll see how underground uses have changed in some ways, and in others, how they're no different from the past. The picture, as it always has been with tunnels in the underground, is pretty complicated. Let's start in 1853 with the construction of the 11,000 square foot tunnel under Napoli, the Galleria Borbonica. It was built by the Bourbon ruler Ferdinand II, who feared a revolution by the Neapolitans, and so commissioned the construction of a subterranean passageway large enough for troops and horses to pass unobstructed and as quickly as possible from the royal palace to the military barracks. While the tunnel was used again in the 1930s to store impounded and contraband vehicles, which the famously tightly packed city had no space for, and then again during the Second World War as an air raid shelter for many Neapolitans, this was finally sealed off in the 1950s and forgotten about for over 50 years. Only in 2012, when a 90-year-old World War II veteran who remembered hiding down there during the war, who led a Neapolitan geologist down there, was the Galleria Borbonica finally rediscovered. It took 3 years to excavate all that was to be found down there in the ancient passageways, 150 meters beneath the Piazza del Plebiscito. All kinds of artifacts from vintage cars to World War II relics. But while the Galleria Borbonica never fulfilled its original purpose, some tunnels of the industrial era that did were never able to be seen again. During the Siege of Petersburg in July of 1864, right at the end of the American Civil War, the Union Regiment from the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry, many of whom were experienced miners from Pennsylvania's anthracite coal regions, spent a month digging a 500-foot horizontal tunnel towards and under Confederate lines and fortifications, and then two-sided tunnels, or drifts, 75 feet each along the enemy's lines. They then filled these drifts with 4 tons of gunpowder, and on July 30th at 5 o'clock a.m., they blew up the Confederate battery, along with the entire infantry regiment, making a crater 170 feet long, 80 wide, and 30 deep, and in the words of a Southern soldier, sending several hundred yards of earthwork and men and cannon, literally hurling 100 feet in the air. But the attacking Union troops, meant to follow up the surprise attack, instead ran straight into the crater, and it was the Confederates instead who lined its sides and poured gunfire down on the helpless, trapped soldiers, leading ultimately to a Confederate victory. The Union command was pretty embarrassed by this loss, which came to be called the Battle of the Crater. With Grant writing in his personal memoirs, the effort was a stupendous failure, and effectively ended General Ambrose Burnside's military career, who handed in his resignation in April of the following year. While that's perhaps the most catastrophic attempt at such a tactic, it's by no means the latest one on offer. During the infamous Battle of the Somme of World War I, French sappers, some of whom might have passed through the Naars of subterranean complex on the way over, dug 22 tunnels in 18 months underneath the German trenches at the Messines-Witzchete Ridge. Although the Germans discovered one of the tunnels, the sappers had done their jobs well, and the remaining 21 shafts were filled with 450 tons of TNT. On the evening before the detonation, British Major General Charles Harrington told his staff, "Gentlemen, we may not make history tomorrow, but we shall certainly change the geography." And he was right. The blast blew the whole crest off the ridge as it pulverized 10,000 German soldiers. It was so enormous that the British Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, claimed he'd heard the blast all the way over from 10 Downing Street in London. And while this was clearly the most dramatic use of tunnel warfare during the First World War, it was a commonly used tactic since trench warfare formed such an integral part of the strategy on both sides. World War I had made standing armies much more vulnerable thanks to innovations like land tanks, artillery capable of firing high-explosive shells, and airplanes, and national militaries, needing new ways to cope with these problems, resorted to an old tactic. They went underground. The French spent $9 billion building a 280-mile series of tunnels connected to a diesel railway to transport soldiers, supplies, and ammunition safely along the fronts. It was called the Maginot Line. And though technically it was quite clever construction, the French were far behind their own times in using it. And when the Germans deployed air raids in their now famous blitzkrieg tactic, the French defenses were useless, all but losing the war before the thousands of soldiers kept underground could fire even a single shot. In 1941, when the blitzkrieg had ravaged the western battlefronts, and thoroughly shaken up the world, the Americans were experimenting with tunnels in the Philippines on Corregidor Island in Manila Bay. They built an 831-foot tunnel, 24 feet wide by 18 feet high, to feed ammunition and supplies to a complex of artillery positions carved out of solid rock. There were 24 lateral tunnels too, used for storage in the troops' quarters. This was the tunnel where U.S. General Douglas MacArthur and his staff, along with the Philippine President Manuel Quezon, took refuge during the Japanese invasion of the island of Luzon in December 1941. Unfortunately, like the Maginot Line just before it, the Malinta Tunnel, as it was called, turned out to be more of a trap than a fortress. It was isolated and useless in the new environment of mobile warfare that defined the Second World War. Just like the Maginot Line, these two sites today are tourist attractions that, more than displaying the technical achievements and engineering savvy of the military leaders of the time, symbolize military folly and backwardness. But some tunneling during World War II did prove somewhat effective. The Japanese had faced down massive tunneling efforts by the Chinese during the start of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937 and 1938. Who around the village of Ranshuang in Hebei province had dug 9 miles of tunnels between houses in the villages and linked them to foxholes on the battlefield, where the Chinese soldiers could pop out and ambush the Japanese from the rear. Their tunnel entrances and exits were cleverly concealed in houses and wells, making their guerrilla efforts very effective at first. When the Japanese finally caught on, they started filling the tunnels with water and poison gas. But the Chinese used advanced tactics to stay ahead. They installed filtering systems that drew off the water and gas and prolonged their cat-and-mouse war with the Japanese. If only the Romans had access to such technology in fighting the Persians and the Greeks. The Japanese went and used this advanced technique against the Marines as World War II progressed, connecting hidden bunkers and emplacements into an elaborate network of tunnels, first on the island of Peleliu and then on Iwo Jima, where they turned a whole mountain, Mount Suribachi, into a literal honeycomb of tunnels and bunkers lined with concrete, with multiple exits so that attacking Marines clearing one end of the tunnels would suddenly find themselves being attacked from the rear. For the Americans, clearing the Japanese from the tunnels was lethal and gruesome work. Since the Americans ruled poison gas out based on their rules of engagement, the Marines had to work with hand grenades, flamethrowers, and explosive charges. On Peleliu, the Americans suffered twice as many casualties, mainly because of the tunnels, as Marines fighting nearby on Tarawa. As for those on Iwo Jima, they were still clearing the tunnels 2 months after the island had fallen to American control. This marks, in a sense, the beginning of the long 20th century legacy of asymmetric warfare, which we'll be getting into in just a minute. By inflicting as many casualties as possible, the Japanese made the American path to victory as slow, painful, and costly as possible, and helped to deter a full-scale invasion of Japan's home islands. But in the end, the Americans resorted to a tactic that would put a quick end to the war and inaugurate a new era of underground concerns, the atomic bomb. With the dramatic opening of the nuclear age, major powers all over the world scrambled to devise new means of protecting chains of command and political emergency powers. Militaries had to dig even deeper underground to protect themselves from nuclear attack. The U.S. built nuclear-proof shelters all over the country, one of which was a 5-acre network of tunnels buried over a mile down into the solid granite of Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, which today is home to the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and 120 feet beneath the White House. The Presidential Emergency Operations Center was built, although, as of today, neither of the two have been put to the real test. In the United Kingdom, a 35-acre subterranean complex was built 100 feet beneath the village of Corsham, out of a series of existing tunnels and stone quarries, for top British government members to retreat to in the event of a nuclear strike warning. It's known today as the Burlington Bunker. Not even 10 years later, the Chinese opted for the same security measure, but added a bit of flair to their work. Called the Dixia Chang, or the Beijing Underground City, the hand-dug site is supposedly capable of housing 1 million people for up to 4 months. It consists of nuclear fallout-proof rooms and tunnels that creep their way underground over an area of several dozen square miles, with some passageways large enough for tanks to pass through, and some spaces meant to preserve the social functioning too, like schools, hospitals, granaries, restaurants, and even a skating rink, and a 1,000-seat movie theater. Today, these decaying tunnels still exist and have never been put to real use. It's no surprise that the Chinese undertook an underground venture of this scale, considering already the tactics they'd used during the Second Sino-Japanese War. But that wasn't all. In the Korean War of the early 1950s, North Korean and Chinese forces revolutionized both the scale and sophistication of underground warfare in order to dodge American air power. They built such extensive underground fortifications that for every mile of military front on the surface, there were 2 miles of tunnels underground, which tallied up to over 300 miles of tunnels. These were built mostly by prisoners who ripped out more than 70 million cubic feet of rock to make room for the structures that were to house and hide tens of thousands of soldiers, along with supplies and even entire artillery batteries that could quickly be wheeled out of mountains and hillsides to fire on South Korea or UN forces, only to be drawn back in just as quickly. As you can see, the communists of the 20th century lent helping hands to each other in any ways they could, from outright manpower to tactical and strategic leads. So it's quite natural that tunneling would be used by the communist Viet Cong fighters in the Vietnam War. But while the Viet Cong's tunnels were nowhere near as massive as the North Korean version, they were just as deadly and difficult to deal with, and allowed the guerrilla war to go on for years against far more numerous and powerful foes. The Cu Chi tunnels, close to Saigon, was the biggest underground complex used in the war, and these began during Vietnam's communist insurgency against the French colonial military in the 1950s. The tunnels ran some 200 miles towards the Cambodian border and contained ammunition storage units, barracks, workshops, kitchens, hospitals, and even theaters, since even propaganda has to be carried underground. At first, the US military was clueless about all this. In 1966, they built a 1,500-acre base camp housing 4,500 troops directly over the Cu Chi tunnels. Soon enough, black-clad guerrillas began organizing attacks on the base, popping out under the cloak of night to blow up planes and steal weapons and other equipment, including even a tank at one point. So the Americans declared Cu Chi a free fire zone and pounded the surface over the tunnels with artillery, bombs, and napalm. But this had no effect on the guerrillas, who simply waited out the bombing and prepared to strike again. And according to one historian, it went even further than this. The tunnels, it's claimed, made it so easy to infiltrate the US military that at one point, all 13 of the barbers at the base were members of the Viet Cong. Finally, an Australian engineer revealed to the US Army that the tunnels underneath the base were far more extensive than they'd previously imagined, and the Americans realized they needed to change up their strategy in order to remain afloat in the war. That's how the Tunnel Rat legacy began. The Tunnel Rats, fearless and fearsome fighters, were a mix of Australians, Americans, and New Zealanders who actually squeezed into the tunnels through holes barely 2 feet wide, the same as the slip-outs of the Erdstall tunnels, armed usually with nothing more than a small pistol, a few grenades, and a flashlight. What they found and fought against was any soldier's nightmare. It was a vast labyrinth of communication tunnels leading to multiple caves and caverns built on 4 different levels, and these were filled with booby traps, snakes, scorpions, bat hordes, and vicious Viet Cong fighters. In these cramped and pitch-black conditions, they attempted to clear out the Cu Chi complex from the inside, while American B-52 bombers pounded the tunnels from above, trying to collapse them. In the Cu Chi operation, roughly 12,000 Viet Cong fighters were killed, and though the operation was ultimately successful, the tunnel complex only began to be secured just as the US withdrew from the war. To this day, the Vietnamese honor the Tunnel Rats as the toughest and deadliest foe they've ever faced. Not only are the Cu Chi tunnels still in existence today, they were actually revived by the Vietnamese in 1978 during the Chinese invasion. And in the same period as the Chinese invasion, the North Koreans were back at it with tunneling efforts yet again. The leaders of Pyongyang seem to have gained something of a fancy for tunnels, and to prepare for another invasion of South Korea, they designed tunnel complexes that stretched underneath and across the demilitarized zone between 2 countries, which had been created at the end of the Korean War in 1953. And was intended to serve as a buffer between the 2 countries to prevent conflict from breaking out again. From 1974 to 1990, South Korean authorities found 4 massive tunnels coming in from North Korea under the border. Each tunnel was over 300 feet underground, each measuring 2 meters high and 2 wide, roughly enough for 3 North Korean soldiers to march through shoulder to shoulder. In other words, big enough for a full division of North Korean troops, about 10,000 soldiers to pass through every hour. This was understandably alarming to the South Koreans, who found that one tunnel emptied out just 30 miles away from Seoul, the capital city of South Korea. Though South Koreans closed the tunnels as they found them and found their last one in 1991, one wonders just how many of these tunnels might remain undiscovered, or to what lengths the North Koreans might have gone to remain underground, undetected, and prepared to strike. Such is the landscape of warfare today, with the underground tunnel complex being an especially popular method for rogue states and insurgent movements such as Al-Qaeda and more recently, ISIS. It's known that Al-Qaeda's last hideout and stronghold in Afghanistan was a cave and tunnel complex in Tora Bora, and ISIS fighters dug huge networks of tunnels under cities and cross borders as part of their asymmetric warfare waged against conventional armed forces. Their tunnel systems allowed them to move stealthily, strike quickly, and escape capture, just as the Viet Cong were able to do, and the Germanic tribes against the Romans long ago. During the Battle of Mosul in 2016-17, Iraqi troops and Kurdish Peshmerga forces found that the road into the city had been completely honeycombed with tunnels, many of which were booby-trapped. And the city of Mosul had underneath it an extensive network of tunnels and bunkers which the rogue fighters used to retreat, control drones for information collection, and identify the location of enemy troops without the risk of foreign detection. A similar situation was revealed in Fallujah, where tunnels were again used by ISIS fighters to evade enemy surveillance drones, artillery shells, and US-led airstrikes. To keep drones and satellites from gleaning data on their digging, the fighters hid the dirt they excavated in nearby houses, and the tunnels were far from primitive in construction and finish. Many were lit with electric lights, some had dormitories, flowered wallpaper, and makeshift kitchens. Colonel Fala al-Obadai summed up the situation well when he said, "It's like we're fighting 2 wars in 2 cities. There's the war on the streets, and there's a whole city underground where they're hiding." Now it's hard to consider an area liberated because, though we control the surface, ISIS will appear from underground. As the Vietnam War and more recent instances of asymmetric warfare have shown us, this new style of waging war can lead to conflicts without end, and call for novel responses and more direct solutions than the use of force and warfare. It's ironic that the region in which ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and now Hamas are using for underground warfare is also the first region in which such means of warfare were used. But with that irony also comes a bitter sourness and sense of loss, since it's also the region in which human civilization is known to have begun to flourish, thanks to the precious heritage that's been discovered since. Mosul was almost completely leveled in the terrible battle that took place in 2016. And the ancient city nearby we've already discussed in this video, the second capital of the Assyrian Empire, Nimrud, lay in ruins. When ISIS had swept into Mosul in 2014, some inhabitants of the city begged them to leave Iraq's deep history alone, but their pleas went unheeded. Videos emerged showing fighters demolishing priceless sculptures and stone carvings, using bulldozers, sledgehammers, and power tools. What they didn't destroy with explosives, as if it wasn't already enough, they tore down by hand. According to some experts, 60% of the excavations at Nimrud are now gone, destroyed, and undocumented. The archway entrance to the famous Assyrian Northwest Palace is the only thing that remains, surrounded in a pile of rubble. For nearly 2 centuries, archaeologists did all they could to bring out lessons from our deep past from the site, and now little is left to examine. And some of the most famous, colossal sculptures which stood the test of time are now demolished. Today, it's estimated that a 300-mile-long tunnel network controlled by Hamas runs underneath much of Gaza. Many of these tunnels are concrete reinforced, equipped with electricity and communications, have stores of food and water, and are large enough to hold small gatherings of people and allow vehicles to pass through. Some Israeli military experts have claimed that in a few places, the complexes go as far down as 200 feet deep. It seems like this network, though probably relying on pre-existing tunnels, massively expanded starting in the early 2000s when Hamas decided its use could be perfected. Already in 2001, insurgents used the growing tunnel system to detonate a bomb under the Israeli military post. In 2006, the same system was used in the abduction of an Israeli soldier who remained captive for 5 years. In 2007, when Hamas took control of Gaza, the tunnel construction seems to have expanded rapidly and became integral to the group's strategy of undermining Israel. Below the Earth's surface, they could covertly store weapons, train fighters, house control centers, and hold prisoners. But that's not all. In 2014, the tunnel use was expanded to include the possibility of penetrating the Israeli borders and attacking border control posts. The tunnels may also serve human shield functions, since, according to Israeli officials, the main control centers are located under Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza, making it the wrong political decision to eliminate it from above, for obvious reasons. Officials also maintain that Hamas uses tunnels under schools, hospitals, and mosques to serve as hiding places. Egyptian and Israeli authorities have spent years trying to block the tunnels, since the former, the cross-border flow of illegal militants and goods, poses a security issue, and for the latter, the tunnel system itself represents a significant threat to its internal security. But beyond the domain of speculation, the tunnel system of Hamas is referred to by some as the Gaza Metro, for a quite obvious reason. It runs under one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. It follows that any attempts to destroy, enter, or take apart the tunnels will necessarily lead to the demolition of civilian sites and other above-ground infrastructure, not to mention the actual civilian populations themselves. Will Israel engage in counter-tunneling? Will they flood the tunnels, risking the collapse of civilian infrastructure in Gaza? Or will this war, like so many others in which tunnels have been used, go on and on, with no end in sight? Only time will reveal the answers to these questions. But what we can be sure of, at the very least, is that so long as humans are around to resist and there's solid earth beneath our feet to stand on, undermining, along with major innovations, breakthroughs will always be possible. It's one of the most basic possibilities to be wasted, exploited, or have used against you in our long, or perhaps quite short, human history.